them for future study of the book, if that's all right with y'all?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right. So this is the question answer. So the way we're going to run it is that we are going to have you posting your questions in the chat. So put it on everyone, post it in the chat, and then I will call on you to unmute. So if you don't know how to unmute, there should be a button at your bottom left that has a microphone that says mute or unmute. So that's how we'll have you unmute so you can ask your questions. Questions can be asked in English, Spanish, or French. So those are our limitations for languages. Other than that, it's good. So go ahead and ask any questions. And as you know, if you don't ask, I've got plenty. But please ask your questions because I don't want to monopolize, even though, you know. Anyone? All right, I'll get us started then. All right, so for your lesson design, for the CAPA, for integrating the CAPA model in the lesson design, one of the issues that I've seen happen is it's sort of hard to fit into one lesson sometimes, like a single lesson. Do you foresee it more as sort of bits of sort of like a unit, like a week-long plan, like over the week you would do the contextualization and then the awareness and then later on? So it might be over like one a day or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. It wasn't really designed to fit into one lesson. It was all of the teachers I've worked with, and I think Dee as well, it really becomes a unit. And the teachers I've worked with, it could be up to 2 weeks or maybe just 1 week. I did work with an English immersion teacher in Japan who was really interested in trying to incorporate it into one lesson because she had, you know, maybe a 70-minute period with grade 2 children. But I don't think it worked all that well. I mean, it's not impossible, but the model is really designed to be more of a unit, right, Dee?
Yeah, and in fact, in unit and lesson development, again, we use those CAPA phases, not necessarily going into the same depth as Roy was introducing earlier with the Jacques Cartier example, but still in a unit. In a unit, you have to be able to integrate language and content. And so we use those as lesson phases as well. And the way that we've organized our units is dividing them into modules, larger modules. And then each module is divided into daily lessons. And so we would see the CAPA sequence or the CAPA model really fitting in a module. So if you were to look at page, let me see if I can find that. Yeah. If you look at page 189 in the book, basically this is how we envision unit design. You've got this larger unit, and then you develop modules based on various topics, and then those modules are divided into daily lessons, right? I forgot to mention when I was answering the last question that the end of the final part of the book provides very detailed appendices. Appendix A, B, and C are really sort of illustrate the process of developing an entire unit overview, developing one complete module with multiple daily lessons, and then developing a final assessment that's linked to that unit. And the unit, the theme that we use for an example is the theme of adaptations, and it's focused primarily on animal adaptations. And this actually was modified based on a unit that was developed by a group of teachers that were in a class with me some years ago. I modified it more for the two-way context so that we could illustrate how a teacher needs to address both of those linguistic groups in a two-way context, and how you need to differentiate language objectives as well, so that you're always making sure that while you are certainly thinking about your second language learners, you're also ensuring that you are challenging and continuing to push and develop the language of the children that already are quite proficient in that language.
Excellent. So we have a question from Melissa Gallagher. Melissa, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. So I was thinking about what you've been discussing about scaffolding language and language in the content areas. And I was wondering if the research that you're drawing from is across all content areas. Has it been done in social studies, science, and math, or is it more focused in one of those content areas? And then if it's more focused in one, could those strategies be generalized across the content areas?
That's a really good question. The kinds of scaffolding that we discuss in the book really has more to do with scaffolding language. And it seems to me that it's equally equivalent or equally applicable across different academic disciplines. Would you say so, Dee?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that I think that the examples that we give, the different types of strategies that we're introducing you to, would be applicable across any content area.
You know, I'd just like to say too that what's interesting about immersion is that it brings this constant language focus to learning subject matter, which makes it, I think, a really rich program, because in a regular non-immersion program, I'm not sure they're engaging to the same extent in scaffolding language. Unless they're English language learners, unless there's a language focus. So I don't think subject matter teachers deliberately or intentionally bring in much of a language focus. And I think that's what's interesting about immersion and makes it a rich and successful program.
Thank you. All right, so we also have Marie, who I believe is Marie Nicole Zahn, but who has a question about writing. Can you go ahead and ask your question, Marie?
Oui, bonjour à tout le monde. I would like to know if you could address specifically the teaching of the writing skills. What kind of scaffolding techniques do you recommend? Personally, I always valued the importance of modelization, the teacher giving a model sentence and asking students to provide information coming from them, following my model. So how else can we develop writing skills in the immersion language class?
Mm-hmm. A good question too. I mean, so much of my work has been based on second language acquisition research. So there's a huge focus on oral development. And what I want to say about writing is that whatever you do in writing, make sure that it starts out from oracy, you know, so that you're starting with oral language and then moving into writing. And of course, modeling is an excellent technique. I don't know, Dee, do you have?
Yeah, you know, in the book, in chapter 9, where we focus on biliteracy development, we do talk about teaching writing, and we draw upon a number of different recommended approaches to teaching writing that are research-based. And so you might want to have a look at that. I think that, you know, what's really true is that teaching writing is really quite complex. And there would also be some other resources that you could draw on for teaching writing. We only have one chapter in the book devoted to biliteracy development. We're doing both reading and writing and literacy and biliteracy. And it's really quite a, you know, it's not enough space really to do justice to all of it. So at any rate, I think there are a number of really good resources out there for teaching writing to second language learners. So look at some of this stuff that you could find for ESL, for teaching ESL writing, and a lot of that can be adapted for the immersion context.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a lot of questions in the chat box.
We have a lot of questions in the chat box. So I'm just gonna pick one out. So M Marks is saying she's from Kelsey at la Lycée Français. And it was, do you want to do that or you just want me to read it?
I'll go ahead. I can ask my question verbally. So I personally work with second grade students, and a lot of their understanding of syntax and their vocabulary is still very much in sort of the emerging stage. And so I found it very interesting whenever you were talking about giving corrective feedback and using prompting in order to get them to self-correct. However, my students are not quite at the level of being able to correct themselves just yet. So do you have any suggestions that would put the onus more on the student to self-correct without giving them necessarily the correct formulation of the sentence, and making them sort of parrot it back, because that's sort of what we end up doing a lot of the time?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And it is kind of a dilemma for teachers. So as I said, clearly you don't want to prompt students to self-repair if they're not at a stage where they can. And when it comes to syntax, if the syntax is rather complicated, you have two choices, I think, and prompting really isn't one of them. I think if the students are struggling with a syntactic issue, you could let it go. You know, we have to let certain things go. You might want to be focusing on something else. Maybe it's just way too difficult. Or you could provide a recast. So that's where you would do the reformulation for sure. And you can feel totally comfortable about recasting. You know, when I talked about feedback, I do always encourage teachers to try to use more prompts than recasts, simply because we know from research that recasts are overused. But when it comes to younger learners, I would focus in terms of prompting. If with your second graders, in terms of prompting, I would focus on items easier to focus on. Maybe something like grammatical gender or something. You know, the student says something like, I don't know, le bouteille. You could say le bouteille. Well, no, that's not a recast. So, yeah, so you don't want to recast, right? You want to kind of push them, and they want you want them to understand what they just said, and to see if they can self-repair. So if you have a discourse where you're highlighting certain things, like, and really making an effort to distinguish between le and la and un and une, if you have that in your discourse, you can prompt those, especially if there's a binary distinction, you know, something between, let's say, a distinction between avoir and être, or between le and la. Those are good times to prompt. Those are bad times to recast, because that's when students can think, oh, le or la, it doesn't matter. I say la and the teacher says le, you know, it's just all the same thing. But in terms of syntax, either depending on the context, your priorities, your objectives, either let it go or give a nice recast.
All right, thank you. And we also have Diane Duhem, the director of high school for Lycée, which we're really excited that Lycée has gone to high school, who had a question. So a secondary question. Diane, are you on there? There you go. Oh, we actually still can't hear you. Let me just, do you mind if I just read your question? All right, I'm just going to read your question. It says, how do we create language links between English class and French class when the English teacher doesn't speak a single word of French?
Okay, so yeah, I'll answer that to start with, because the context I worked in, actually, it was kind of the opposite. Yeah, in the context of Montreal, we had some French teachers who didn't know English. Most of the English teachers didn't know enough French to do this. It's not impossible. So let's say in where we were studying, you could work with a teacher, you could work with an English teacher who doesn't know French, and you could divide up a chapter book, like from the Magic Treehouse series. And it's really a question of, for example, which vocabulary do you really want to highlight? I mean, that's one way of approaching this. And you should be able to do this. The English teacher should be able to say to you what she thinks is vocabulary, important vocabulary in her English chapter. And then you can make a decision about whether or not the equivalents in French are equally important to focus on or not. I mean, you can, and you can also work just at a thematic level So whether the teacher knows the immersion language or not, you could decide on what themes are you going to exploit. I mean, this is the really motivating part for students. It's not even always about, focusing discretely on language. It's like, wow, we're working on the same theme in the English class and the French class, that this is really, we're really working across the curriculum nicely here. So I think that there are ways that you can do it. And I said, my experience is going in the other way, where we worked with French teachers who didn't know much English. And the English teachers were able, as long as one of you knows both languages, you should be able to work it out in terms of themes, key vocabulary. I think it's feasible.
I'll give an example that I had a group of teachers that actually work out at a school in Idaho, in close to Sun Valley, Idaho. And there was they have a 50-50 program. So they have English teachers and Spanish teachers that are partnered. And so they developed a Kappa sequence actually that was linked to a bilingual read aloud project. And they were using Tommy Unger's Crichter, as Roy was talking about earlier. And their emphasis for literacy was to really get kids to write more descriptive text. And so their grammar focus was adverbs, okay? And the English teacher didn't know any Spanish, but the Spanish teacher was bilingual, right? And so they did a lot of collaborative planning in English. And then the English teacher did, her activities in English, and the Spanish teacher did them in Spanish. And just as Roy was saying earlier, they weren't repeating the same thing in both classrooms, but they were building upon what the other teacher had done, right? So it was this continuous sequence, if you will, of activities that were getting kids to understand how to create adverbs. In English, using the ly suffix, and in Spanish, mente, the suffix mente, and writing text around that and all sorts of things. So, and it worked super, super well. They carried it out in their classroom and it was excellent. This is actually described in the book as well, in the biliteracy chapter, pages 255 and 256. So it's sort of a combination of bilingual read aloud and the Kappa model, and how the teachers did that. They were focusing on, like I said, the adverbs.
So it looks like a lot of the questions were about this this collaboration from what I'm seeing on here. I'm seeing if I've missed another question, because we have questions about collaborating with English teachers, the writing. Oh, if you had questions about writing, Dee put a bunch of external resources there for writing for you, Escamilla et al., Paraguay, and
2 resources.
2 resources, but then you always look in the bibliography, you find a bunch more.
Yeah, Paraguay and Boyle is a book that has been around for a long time. They've had multiple editions of that book because it's so well used and well liked. We use it in our teacher preparation program for ESL and world language teachers, and it's really an excellent resource for literacy writ large.
All right. Am I missing someone's question? Because I think that was...
Yeah, I think that there were some questions earlier in the chat box, and also
Yes.
Adriana Spicer said that she had a question to ask.
Okay. Why don't we get Adriana, and then I'll look up in my chat. Adriana, go ahead and
Yes, I would just wanted to make a comment on, what we were talking about, just the partnership with English teachers. I was able to work with a teacher for almost 16 years, and I can tell the richness of the language in both English and Spanish, but now I'm having to start over with a new teacher. So my question is, what would be some ways to engage, the English partnership to be able to work or collaborate together? Because that's what I'm finding the challenge. since she doesn't have the deeper understanding of immersion? Like, what would be some suggestions you might have?
Maybe she could read chapter 9 of our book. There,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You had, I think was it 2014, Roy, at Carla, if I'm not mistaken, you have a video, because sometimes reading, you have a video that I think just describes this sort of the biliteracy piece that you did. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of video data that I'm not able to share because of not having permission from parents to. We had permission to make the videos for professional development purposes, but not to share. So yeah, we have a lot of data that shows the enthusiasm of the children in these kinds of projects. So
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a quick sec. I think that Michelle might be referring to a video that is of you giving a presentation on the bilingual read aloud and biliteracy development at the Carla conference. And it might have been the Carla, I don't know if it was the one that we worked on together, Roy, was that 2016?
That was 2016, I think.
So
yeah.
There was a conference in 2012 and another in 2016. And I think did you also speak at the no, you didn't speak at the North Carolina conference, right? But so it's either one of those, and I will give you the website for Carla. And if you go under professional development, you'll find the conference archives, and all of the conference archives have videos of all of the people that have spoken at these conferences before. And so there are, from many of the conference archives, there are many examples of videos that Roy has discussing corrective feedback, discussing the bilingual reader out loud project, discussing just pedagogical issues in general, as he's given plenary presentations at many of these conferences. So those videos are available for you, and I'll provide you with the website and tell you exactly how you would get. I could show you if you want. We could go, if you want me to share my screen, I could show people, but it's up to you, Michelle.
You can send it. You can send it to me, and when I do the post-conference mail out, I'll add those the directions and the link to that. That way we can go.
I'm just putting it in the chat box as well.
Perfect. All right. Sorry, Roy, you were saying.
Well, no, that was my reply. I mean, the partner teacher in question, yeah, needs to be convinced that it's useful. But the point is that when children are learning or are becoming biliterate, there's so much evidence showing that it's important for them to be able to make connections across languages, and to make those connections. It really helps if there is some sort of partnership between teachers of both languages. These kinds of a teacher on her own can also make cross-linguistic connections in her own class without the collaboration of another teacher. But yeah, my work with teachers shows that some contexts lend themselves better to collaboration than others. I mean, some teachers are real collaborators and maybe some others aren't, but students really like to see their teachers working together. I can say that.
Excellent. And Sophie Cap-Martin, I believe you had a question about the book.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, first, thank you for having this. This is great. So I have kind of like a general question. Actually, with the middle school team, French team, sorry, we are a French immersion school. I'm at Lycée Français. We've been working on the Professor Lyster's book, Vers une approche intégrée, so I mean, basically, it's easier for our French-speaking teachers to read the French version. And then we actually had a session, last session was last Monday, and one question of the teachers was, we are a French accredited school, so we work on both the French program and the Louisiana program in French. But one of the concerns of the teachers is that while they teach in French, the students at the end of the school years, they have to take the standardized testing, LEAP or EOCs, or, you know, depending on the level of the students, in English. So it's always a concern, you know, how do I prepare best my students for that? And then it's kind of like I have two questions. On the, when you share your studies in the book, so I guess I'm more familiar with Professor Lyster's book. Are any of the Canadian studies include schools that students have to take standardized testing in English, or do they have to take tests in French? That's my question number one. And I guess question number two, which is if you have visual displays, especially, you know, like word walls, things like that, in the French classroom, how would you what would be your recommendations to like best utilize those type of tools?
Well, so for the first question, yeah, in Canada, there's less standardized testing than there is in the United States. And if there are tests, they might be in English, but they could also be in French. So I don't know, Dee, if you might be better placed to address the issue of immersion in the States, where they're studying in the immersion language, yet tested in English?
Yeah, so in Minnesota anyway, the kids are tested in grades 3 and 5, not in other grades, but in grades 3 and 5. And in grade 3, they in our early total programs, or our 90-10 programs, they haven't had a lot of exposure yet to English in the curriculum, right? Most of the instruction is happening through Spanish or French or German. And what we have found that a lot of the schools do is they'll prepare a packet of to send home with kids and to the parents as well, that provide. See, the thing is that when kids are learning concepts in French, those concepts don't have to be relearned in English, right? That will transfer over. What doesn't transfer necessarily is vocabulary, especially vocabulary that isn't cognate. And so what we find teachers do is they'll send home these packets providing kids with the vocabulary equivalents in English. And sometimes they'll give a little workshop, like on a Saturday morning, to teach the kids the vocabulary that they need for English. But the concepts should be there because they've been learning those concepts, and those concepts will transfer. Just the vocabulary is new, right? The vocabulary is different. So we also try to really emphasize how important it is for administrators to be really understanding that we don't necessarily expect kids to be performing at grade level in grade 3 if they're in a program where there hasn't been instruction in English very much until, you know, later in the program. Now, by grade 5, we certainly expect them to be on grade level, and they usually are. So at any rate, I think there are a number of things related to standardized testing that are key.
Sophie, you had a second question too, but I'm not sure.
Yes, I guess the second question, it's it kind of going back to this idea of packet being sent home about vocabulary. You know, I know our teachers use a lot of words wall, and they tend to do it bilingual. So, you know, the kids are instructed in French, but in the classrooms, they do have some like visual support to help them make the connections with the vocabulary words in English. Within the context of a contextualized approach, you know, like, does it make sense to have like, do you have any like suggestions about reading, or what would be the best practice on organizing those words walls? Should like words always be included in a sentence structure? Like, because kind of like commonly it's more organized as like just like the word in French with the word in English with a different colored use, like, you know.
I don't really recommend that you have translated word walls. I don't recommend that at all. You can have a word wall in the second language, and in another part of the classroom, if you teach both languages, or in the English classroom, you have a different word wall in English, but I don't recommend bilingual word walls. It would be better for there to be pictures of whatever the word signifies. And I've seen teachers, a couple of things, certainly in Spanish as well as in French, you've got grammatical gender. So the words are always introduced with the article, and they often come up with a school agreed upon color coding for gender. So, you know, masculine words are in green, feminine words are in blue, whatever the school decides, and they consistently do that on word walls. I've also seen them organize word walls by part of speech, you know, so they'll have verbs in one category and nouns in a category and adjectives in a category and so on, like that. But I think that you have to be thoughtful about the way that they are created, and they have to be very dynamic. So they're going to change over time, and they should as students learn and things like that. But boy, I do not support the idea of a bilingual word wall. Not a good idea, in my opinion.
All right, thank you. We have a question also that I missed from Claudia Lejeune, which I couldn't find. But so Claudia, go ahead and tell us what your question is. Are you
Yes,
on?
yes.
Okay, there you go.
So on page 135, there was a chart with the word, the illustration, the meaning, the example, and there was no example. What does that mean, no example? Do you mean a bad example of the use of a word?
Yeah, so you're referring to the Freyer model for developing vocabulary understanding, and the word goes in the center, and then you have the meaning, right? Significado, you have meaning, and then you have an illustration. So kids need to draw a picture if they can of what the word is. And then an example, ejemplo, and no ejemplo means a non-example. So what you're trying to do is to help kids understand maybe opposites or something that is not reflective of that word.
So if it were float, then it would be sink.
Yeah.
Okay, and could you give examples of activities to integrate new words, new expressions, so students actually actively use the vocabulary and not just passively?
Can you just say, to give an example of what?
Of new words and expressions that they are being taught.
Can you give some new words and expressions to give them some context?
Oh, like an idiomatic expression, or this is for higher level students because their progress is slower, and they tend to rely on what they know already, like using beaucoup, for example. J'aime beaucoup.
Yeah, I have some suggestions. So that's one of the things that we know about kids' language, that they tend to learn one word for saying something, and they keep using that word, keep using that word. So what you're talking about is, how do we really expand their vocabulary, right? How do we get them not using the same words again and again and again, and making sure that they're able to, like if they learn the word house in Spanish, casa, la casa, they'll use la casa for everything. They don't use it for cabin or mansion or apartment or condominium or whatever. And what you want to do is expand their vocabulary. So one way to do that is to create classroom scaffolds for expressions, especially for older students, when, for example, if they're going to be in small group work and they have to express an opinion, instead of just I think, there are lots of different ways to say that, and more academically complex ways to say that. My perspective is, in my opinion, etc. Right? And so you create a chart that has these different ways of saying it, and a taboo, you know that game Taboo that you play when there are certain words you're not allowed to say? You know, a taboo phrase would be, I think. So as they're in their groups, you know, if a kid says, I think, that's like a taboo. You can't say that. You have to come up with another phrase, and then you've got a scaffold in the classroom that can support that.
Excellent. So we also have a question from Helen Young from Delaware. Helen?
Sorry, I had to put it on mute. Yes, my question for Professor Lyster is because regarding, I appreciate the sharing and the exchange about the CAPA model. And it's very interesting. Recently, we've been really working on close reading for our middle school immersion teachers and trying to take the more difficult, complex text to another level. And I was pleased to hear about CAPA, but I wanted to know a little bit more about the place of oral language. You know, while we know that as we're trying to get to proficiency, there's a place where students need to get deep into the context of the text itself, and, you know, at different points within close reading. And I recently observed a teacher, you know, starting off trying to conduct close reading, and she right away went from the first reading into asking reading comprehension questions, which students weren't at that level, but yet they understood the nuance because the teacher utilized a little bit more English than she probably should have to explain. I just wanted to get a thought from you and sort of or Dr. Tedick in terms of the model of CAPA overall. Like, if we kind of thinking about the multiple reads, and at what point with oral language, obviously everything should be done in context. We want to give them background knowledge and questions and be able to get deeper into the reading. But I was wondering if you can kind of share with me a little bit about your thoughts or in your research, how that process comes together.
So do you mean specifically during that contextualization phase, how you deal with the text, or to what extent you focus on comprehension? Or
yeah, so in the model itself, as I'm looking at it, so I had to go back to my notes, is that when you first, you know, because I really like the example that you shared in terms of, you know, how the teachers were able to go into the multiple stages within the Jacques, you know, I'm sorry, I'm still trying to find my notes. Yes. So like in terms of getting to the point of being able to analyze the syntax of the language about the verbs and so on and so forth, you know, that was a stage where they had already done their initial reads, right? So the questions for reading comprehension, where they can actually utilize the language in of itself to have an adequate exchange about the text. Usually in close reading, you kind of take that into the third reading before students really had a beefier exchange, because you've had a concentrated time where you're analyzing the text and have developed vocabulary to be able to have the interchange. So I wanted to, you know, understand, particularly with your work with oral language, I wanted, you know, when we talk about oracy, you know, should we be doing oracy along the way with each of the close reads in order to get to that deeper level, or should we really follow sort of that model of getting them deeper into the text, understanding the text with multiple reads before the reading comprehension and student, you know, like interchange happens?
right. So in the context of the unit that I described about Jacques Cartier, what's interesting about it, I think what's important to mention is that the text had been written by the teachers themselves. So they took texts, they looked at a lot of different texts and came up with their own text that wasn't using, you know, complex vocabulary. It was, and well, what they did do was they really flooded the text with instances of the past tense, because that's ultimately what they wanted to focus on. So in terms of comprehension, I think that it wasn't a problem for the students, and they weren't reading at first. Remember, they're just listening to the text. And, you know, what doesn't come across in my presentations is that some of these teachers might have spent many lessons on that text, you know, so that the students were listening to it many times and then discussing it orally. They were fourth grade students. They already had a vocabulary that allowed them to understand the main points of these voyages. So they weren't starting with a text per se. They did that in the next stage. I guess the point of the Kappa model that I didn't state at all very clearly is that the way it works is that you start with the content and you do whatever you need to develop students' understanding of that content, and then you zoom in on language during the awareness phase and also the practice phase, but then you come back to the content during the autonomy stage, where the focus is more on output, whereas in the initial contextualization phase, the emphasis is more on input. So that's really the progression in this model. And in terms of different ways of approaching the reading, I would say it's quite an open model so that you could approach that the way that works best for you and your students during the contextualization phase before zooming in on language.
Okay, thank you so much.
Helen, do you happen to work with Lynn Fulton Archer? Say
Yes,
hi for me. Say
I
hello
work
for
with
me.
Lynn and Gregory. Yes. I'll let them know you say hi.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're muted, Michelle.
See, I'm sorry, knew I would mess things up. I was doing so well. So Siran, we have probably time for one more question, and I see Siran from Lake Charles missed this question, or so if Siran wanted to ask the question about grade level literacy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this is Siran from Lake Charles. Okay, our curriculum authorities just want us to really teach. They really want us to teach what is going on in the English class. When I take literacy, for example, my sixth graders, when I try to really focus or copy what is going on in the English class, I find out that my sixth graders don't have the same language level. For example, in the sixth grade book in the English class, there's a use of past tense. My sixth graders don't know past tense yet. So my question is, how can we possibly really adapt what is happening in the French immersion class to what happening in the English class, knowing that the grade level is not the same?
I'm sorry, before they answer that question, are you saying that they're telling you to teach the same thing?
Yeah, we have to teach the same content, literacy content in the English class, going to the English teacher and trying to find the literacy content they are teaching and teach the same thing in the French immersion class, which is very hard to do. So my question is, how can we possibly really do that? Because of the language level of the French immersion student is not exactly the level that the counterparts have in English. For example, a sixth grader amount of English is far, far, far more than the French immersion sixth graders amount of French. So the language levels are not the same.
Right. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this kind of approach where usually an immersion program isn't set up so that classes, the language arts in the immersion language isn't set up just to reflect what's going on in the English class. So yeah, there seems to be a bit of a problem there. I don't know, are you familiar with this, Dee?
No, and I think that it's really a misguided administrator. I think that the administrator really doesn't understand immersion and needs to understand that what happens in the French portion of the day is different from what happens in the English portion of the day. And we wouldn't really expect a sixth grader to be reading in French necessarily at exactly the same level that they would in English. Their English vocabulary is likely to be much stronger, and they may be able to read it at a stronger level. Although, you know, the studies have shown that kids in immersion programs develop really strong reading comprehension. So, you know, by grade 6, we would like to see them be able to be reading at grade level. Mm-hmm. You know, and we would expect that, certainly based on research. Wouldn't you agree with that, Roy? That we'd like to see that they're able to, and that's not to say they're able to understand every single vocabulary word necessarily, but, you know, kids don't do that in English either. They need to know how to distinguish between really key vocabulary and vocabulary that they might be able to skip over if they don't happen to know a word, right? But those are skills that by grade 6, they really should have, and they should be reading on grade level at grade 6.
And they should also know, they need to be able to recognize past tenses in French too. I mean, not all of them, but the main ones.
Produce them.
Yeah.
Produce some anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So what, and this is just what might be happening is that if you're doing the same thing twice, and this is back from gifted ed, if they're doing the same thing twice, then the second time they do it, they're not going to want to do it. Like, I mean, that could be part of it. The other thing is maybe it seems like it would be like more of like a scaffolding, wouldn't you say, Dee and Roy? Like if you have this content, because the English is only teaching English, and then the French is going to be scaffolding. I know Lake Charles has those checklists. They have checklists of the language they're supposed to be teaching. Marie, am I wrong on that? So they have a checklist that scaffolds the English Common Core one, but they don't require them to reproduce the exact same thing.
You're right, Michelle. The curriculum encourages teachers to try and mirror one of the units that is being taught in the ELA class. It's not all of the units, it's just one.
Yeah, so there's a misunderstanding going on here then.
Okay, yeah, maybe, might be, okay.
Yeah, because if you're redoing the whole thing, then that's a lot of extra repetition for the child.
Yeah, we really wouldn't want to see that. The immersion programs are not designed to have teachers repeating the same content and the same activities and foci and in both languages. That's not the way these programs are set up.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, so we are out of time, but I wanted to thank, and I put a reaction here so we could do a little hand clapping. I wanted to thank Roy and Dee for coming. We're really excited. I really enjoyed this. I hope everyone else enjoyed it. I had a really good time. And so we all have our breakout sessions that are going to be starting at 1 o'clock. So in 1 hour, we'll have breakout sessions starting. I sent you the Zoom links. If you did not get them, then go ahead and email me. We need them again to give us some new numbers. So last time you gave us, I think, 27 and 68. So if you can give me new numbers, again, we have if you're a French teacher or working with a French teacher, we have the appelé. For any other teacher, we have the Beau Soleil. So if you want to give me two more numbers, that would be helpful. Roy, give me a number between 1 and 92.
53.
53. All right. And Dee?
19.
19. All right. So 19 is Vesna Dimitrievska. Mara's clapping, so I'm assuming that's a North Carolina person. No. Vesna Dimitrievska. So Vesna, if you could message me privately with your email, I'll send that to Flo so she can get you. Vesna, what do you teach? French or Spanish or Russian? Not sure. Just let me know, because that would be whether you'd get the Beau Soleil or the appelé. And give me, and then 53 is, see, 53 is Véronique Gâteau. So Véronique, what level do you teach, Véronique? Because if you teach younger levels, then 4th or 5th. Okay. All right.
I teach 4th grade.
Fourth grade. So maybe look at appelé, but if not, we can get you the Beau Soleil one. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so that was what we have. We're going to come back at 1 o'clock at breakout session 1. So go ahead and meet us then. Other than that, thank you for coming. Thank you, Roy and Dee, for coming. And thank you for this fabulous book that is really, really useful to us in all different ways, depending on who.
Thank you so much. I'll just say I'm sorry I didn't start recording the first session immediately. It wasn't on my radar because we hadn't talked about recording, but I did start recording at about 26 minutes in, and I have recorded the Q&A. So perfect. I'll send those to Michelle.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank
All
you.
right, y'all
Thanks
have
so much for having me.
lunch, and I'll see you later.
Bye, Brenda.
And Dee, you sent me your invoice?
I will send you the videos, yes.
All right. that
And I
was-
did send the invoice, yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.